General William Parker was a man who had seen it all. A U.S. Army general with more than 30 years of service under his belt. He had fought in foreign lands, made tough decisions, and led soldiers through some of the most challenging situations imaginable. But today he was just another driver on the road, making his way from the military base in Albany, Georgia, to a meeting in Americus. It was a trip he had made countless times before, so nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The road was familiar, the sun was shining, and everything was calm. As he drove, the soft hum of his car and the peaceful surroundings of the highway gave him a sense of tranquility. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the air smelled of fresh grass and pine. It was hard to believe that anything could go wrong on a day like today. After all, this was just a regular drive to a routine meeting. Nothing to worry about, nothing to fear, just another task to check off his list. But then something happened that broke the calm. His military-grade GPS, a piece of equipment he trusted to guide him wherever he went, suddenly malfunctioned. A recent update must have messed it up, because the screen was blank, showing nothing but static and glitches. William frowned slightly and glanced down at the device. He knew the road well enough, but it was still an inconvenience to have the GPS fail him. He had driven this exact route so many times before that he could do it with his eyes closed. But the professionalism in him wanted to get the system back on track, so he decided to pull over. No big deal, he thought. Just a quick stop to reset the GPS, and then he'd be on his way. The sign that greeted him, "Evil for me," was a familiar one. He'd passed it many times over the years. It was just a small pull-off, but it was enough to give him the time he needed to fix the GPS. He slowed down, carefully guided the car to the side of the road, and came to a stop. The engine hummed quietly as he parked the car and reached for his phone. The screen lit up, and William saw the name Major Kendall appear on the display. William had spoken to Major Kendall before he was someone he trusted. But today, something in his gut told him that this call would be more important than usual. He took a deep breath and answered the phone. "Major Kendall," he said, his voice calm but alert. The conversation started off routine. Kendall was giving him an update on the security situation surrounding the meeting in Americus, and they quickly ran through the details. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just another briefing for someone like William Parker, who had dealt with high-stakes matters for decades. But as the call went on, something in the back of William's mind began to stir. He didn't know why, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He wasn't sure if it was the tension in Kendall's voice or just the quiet of the afternoon, but something felt off. And then, as if on cue, a sound broke his thought sirens. At first they were faint, but then they grew louder. William glanced in the rearview mirror and saw flashing lights in the distance. A police car was quickly approaching. He hadn't been speeding, he wasn't in a rush, and his car wasn't parked illegally. But as the sirens grew closer, William's heart began to race a little faster. He didn't understand why the officer was stopping him. It was just a simple break to reset his GPS, but something about the situation felt wrong. As he kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, the police car pulled up behind him and came to a stop. William took a slow breath. He knew it wasn't going to be anything serious, maybe just a routine check. But the unease in his stomach wasn't fading, it was only growing. As the police car came to a halt, William's mind shifted from curiosity to caution. He could feel the tension building, even though he tried to remain calm. Out of the police cruiser stepped a woman, tall and confident, with her blonde hair neatly tucked into a bun. She marched toward his car with purpose, her eyes locked on him, not bothering with any of the usual courtesies that would normally come with a traffic stop. William rolled down the window, his face calm, though his pulse had quickened ever so slightly. He wasn't used to being stopped by the police, not like this, not when he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. "Afternoon, officer," he said, giving her a polite but neutral smile. "What seems to be the problem?" The officer didn't offer a smile or any pleasantries. She just looked at him, her voice sharp and commanding. "What are you doing parked here? This is private land. "And you fit the profile," she said, a cold edge to her words. William blinked, surprised. The profile? He didn't know what she meant by that, but he figured she was just doing her job. "I'm just resetting my GPS," he said calmly. "I'll be out of here in a minute." The officer didn't seem convinced. She stepped back slightly, her hand resting on her sidearm as if ready to draw it at a moment's notice. William's eyes caught her badge. It said Wilburn, and he had a moment to glance at her before she spoke again. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," she ordered, her voice low and firm. William's eyebrows furrowed slightly. Step out of the vehicle. He wasn't sure why this was necessary. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't doing anything wrong. But he also knew how to follow orders. He was a military officer, after all. So he slowly opened the door and stepped out, keeping his movements calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation. He didn't want to make it worse than it had to be. But there was a feeling deep down that told him this wasn't going to be a simple traffic stop. "Sir," Officer Wilburn said, her tone harsh as she moved him to the back of the car. "Hands on the trunk. Now." He complied, placing his hands on the back of the car, but he could feel the officer's grip tightening as she positioned him roughly. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. This wasn't just a routine stop. "I'm not resisting," William said calmly, trying to keep his voice even. "But I do need to retrieve my ID from the car. I'm a federal officer." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a step back and sized him up. "You expect me to believe that?" she scoffed, her tone dripping with suspicion. William wasn't surprised by her skepticism, but he wasn't going to let this go. "I don't need you to believe it," he said firmly. "Just check." The officer hesitated but then stepped back to William's car. She opened the door, and for a moment William thought maybe, just maybe, this would be over soon. But as she began flipping through his wallet, she came across something that would change the course of this entire interaction. It was his Pentagon-issued security clearance card, level 4 clearance, the kind of card that only the highest-ranking military officials had. As she flipped through his wallet, the officer's hand stopped when she saw the card. "Where'd you get this?" she muttered, clearly shocked. William didn't flinch. He didn't get angry. He simply said, "I earned it over 30 years of service." For a brief moment, the officer was silent. She stared at the card, her jaw shifting. But instead of apologizing, she closed the wallet with a snap and turned back toward him, still unwilling to admit her mistake. "You could have just told me," she muttered. "I did," William replied, his voice calm but resolute. "I did tell you." As Officer Wilburn tried to regain her composure, William stood still. He was used to pressure. He had faced much tougher situations in his career, but this felt different. He wasn't in a battlefield. He wasn't in a meeting with world leaders. He was standing on a quiet road in Georgia, being treated like a criminal for simply stopping to reset his GPS. But this wasn't just about the inconvenience of the moment. It was about something much bigger: a misuse of power, a failure to see the person in front of you as someone who deserved respect. "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable," William said calmly, his voice carrying across the quiet of the roadside. "I'm asking you to call your supervisor or let me retrieve my ID from the car." The officer seemed unwilling to listen. She was getting more frustrated, but William wasn't going to let her rush him into something he didn't need to do. Just as the tension reached its peak, the sound of a new siren broke through the silence, signaling the arrival of more units. 2, maybe 3 more police cars. It was becoming clear that something bigger was unfolding. The situation was far from over. As Officer Wilburn radioed for backup, William kept his hands on the trunk, trying to remain calm. But in the back of his mind, he knew this was just the beginning. Something was about to change. The narrative now flows into a longer, more detailed series of events, giving the story the depth you're looking for. Let me know if you need further expansions or adjustments to the flow. The sirens grew louder, echoing off the trees, drawing closer to the scene. At first, there was just one more patrol car pulling up behind Officer Wilburn's. Then, another followed. And another. 3 police cars now surrounded William's vehicle, like a circle closing in on prey. But this wasn't an ordinary situation. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop anymore. William could feel it in the air, the tension, the uncertainty, the unspoken realization that something was shifting. He stood calmly with his hands on the trunk, waiting, knowing that any moment could bring something more. But he remained calm. He had been in situations far more intense than this, situations where he had to keep his emotions in check, where lives depended on his ability to stay level-headed. This moment, though frustrating, was not a battlefield. But it was still a test of strength to keep his dignity intact, strength to make sure the situation didn't spiral out of control. Officer Wilburn walked back and forth, trying to regain her footing, as though she were still in control. But William saw the shift in her eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. She was unraveling. The more backup arrived, the more unsure she became of herself. As the last police car came to a halt, out stepped a deputy from the county sheriff's office. Tall, with a heavy build, he didn't rush, didn't immediately draw his weapon. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate walk toward Officer Wilburn. From the way he moved, William knew this deputy wasn't here to escalate things. He was here to fix them. The deputy stopped beside Officer Wilburn and exchanged a few quiet words with her. William couldn't hear them, but the tone of their conversation made it clear Officer Wilburn was in trouble. The deputy looked toward William and raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he moved toward the back of the car. "Sir," the deputy said as he reached William's side, his voice steady but careful, "I need to ask your name." William turned his head slightly, meeting the deputy's eyes. He could see that this officer wasn't here to make things worse. He was here to fix a mistake. William didn't hesitate. "Lieutenant General William Parker," he said plainly. The deputy's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He glanced at the other officers gathered nearby. They were all looking at him now. It was clear they were realizing that they had not just pulled over any ordinary civilian. This was a man with a significant presence, someone who had served his country for decades. The deputy nodded slowly. "Did Officer Wilburn check your ID?" "She had it in her hand," William replied, his voice even. "She didn't fully verify it." The deputy's expression shifted, though he said nothing. He turned back to Officer Wilburn, and it was clear that this was no longer about following procedure. This was about something much bigger. William wasn't just an ordinary driver on the side of the road, he was a high-ranking military officer, a leader with decades of experience. A few more moments of quiet passed. The radio buzzed with communication between officers, and the tension in the air thickened as the minutes dragged on. Officer Wilburn stood by her cruiser, still trying to gather herself, but she wasn't speaking. The deputy turned to William and offered him his phone. "Would you like to make a call, sir?" he asked, his voice respectful. William knew this was the moment everything could change. The officer in front of him wasn't the problem. He wasn't the one who had made the mistake. But Officer Wilburn, with her stubbornness and arrogance, had turned what could have been a routine stop into something ugly. And now, it was time for her mistake to come to light. "I need to call the Department of Defense," William said, his voice steady. "I'm being unlawfully detained." The deputy hesitated for a moment, clearly taken aback by the gravity of the situation. But he didn't argue. Instead, he handed William his phone without hesitation. William held the phone carefully in both hands, the cuffs still tight around his wrists. He dialed the number without hesitation. There were only 3 people in the entire Department of Defense who had the clearance to handle an urgent situation like this. And as the phone rang, he felt a quiet sense of relief wash over him. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Not this time. The phone rang once, then twice. "Major Kendall speaking," came the voice on the other end. William's breath released slowly. "Major Kendall, this is General William Parker. I'm being unlawfully detained by local law enforcement in Shea County, Georgia. I need verification sent immediately." There was a moment of silence on the line, followed by the sound of keys clicking on a keyboard. "Understood, General. Stay on the line. We're alerting the Pentagon liaison to DHS and military police." William could hear the urgency in Major Kendall's voice now. This was no longer about a simple call to verify his ID. It was about the Pentagon involved. The phone clicked again, and a new voice came through. "This is Commander Reeves, sir. We've got your coordinates. Local authorities will be contacted in less than 10 minutes. William exhaled slowly, nodding to himself. "Thank you, Commander. I'll wait." The sirens in the distance began to fade, replaced by a deep rumble that made William's gut tighten. This wasn't a regular patrol car. These were federal vehicles, black SUVs with tinted windows that had the unmistakable aura of power. They rolled into the scene with authority, blocking off the entire stretch of road. William could feel the shift in the air as they came to a stop. The first SUV parked just ahead of Officer Wilburn's cruiser, while the second pulled in directly behind. The doors opened, and men stepped out, two in dark suits, their earpieces barely visible. But there was one who stood out among them. Colonel Errol Gaines, a man with a reputation in military circles, stepped forward. He didn't look at Officer Wilburn. He didn't glance at the deputy. His focus was entirely on William. "Sir, are you all right?" Colonel Gaines asked as he approached, his voice calm but firm. "I'm fine," William replied, offering a small nod. "Just bruised pride." Colonel Gaines's face was hard to read, but he said nothing. He moved past the deputy and Officer Wilburn, who seemed to shrink under the weight of the situation. The federal agents weren't here to add to the chaos, they were here to restore order. "Do you know who you just detained?" Colonel Gaines asked, his voice low, but carrying the weight of the situation. Officer Wilburn's face went pale. She didn't answer. The truth was undeniable now. The officer had made a huge mistake, one that would ripple through the system and cost her much more than just her job. "General Parker is no ordinary civilian," Colonel Gaines continued. "He's a decorated officer, someone with more authority than you could ever understand." As the federal agents took control of the situation, the truth began to unfold. Officer Wilburn, who had been so sure of herself moments earlier, now found herself at the center of a growing storm. The crowd of bystanders had grown larger, and their phones were still recording. No one was speaking, but everyone was watching. The deputy who had handed William the phone now turned to Officer Wilburn, his voice steady but firm. "You need to come with me. We're going to sort this out." Officer Wilburn looked as though she might protest, but the moment passed. She handed over her badge and firearm, her hands shaking as she did. The weight of the situation had finally hit her. The sheriff arrived shortly after, his truck rolling up slowly. He didn't need to yell. His presence alone was enough to silence the crowd. Sheriff Nix stepped out of his vehicle and asked, "What the hell is going on here?" Colonel Gaines stepped forward, explaining the situation. "One of your officers unlawfully detained a general. We need to file a formal complaint." Sheriff Nix looked at Officer Wilburn, then back at General Parker. There was no question in his mind this wasn't just about procedure. This was about accountability. The video of the incident spread like wildfire. Within hours, the story had reached national news. People weren't just angry at Officer Wilburn, they were angry at the system that allowed this to happen time and time again. They were asking why this happened to someone like General William Parker, a man who had devoted his life to service. Protests began, but they were quiet, peaceful demonstrations outside the sheriff's office. People weren't screaming for revenge. They were asking for change. They wanted accountability, not just for this incident, but for the countless others that had gone unnoticed for too long. As the fallout continued, General William Parker remained silent. He didn't seek the spotlight. He didn't speak at rallies or press conferences. Instead, he let the truth do the talking. His actions spoke louder than any words ever could. The accountability came through proper channels, and soon Officer Wilburn was placed on administrative leave, later terminated for her actions. The story didn't end there. The impact was felt across the country. Schools began having discussions about power, respect, and bias. People were talking, thinking, and questioning. General Parker's quiet strength had forced people to confront the uncomfortable truths they had ignored for far too long. The fight wasn't over, but a change had begun. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The story of General Parker wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about the strength to stand tall in the face of injustice, and about how one moment of restraint could change the world. This expanded version of the story is now broken into parts, with each section filled out to be more detailed and engaging. It dives deeper into the emotions, the actions, and the consequences of the situation while keeping it easy to understand. Let me know if you'd like to make any changes. The days following the incident were a whirlwind. News outlets covered the story relentlessly, spreading the video of General William Parker's unlawful detainment to millions of people across the country. The media didn't just focus on the unlawful treatment of a decorated military officer, they focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't about one officer. This was about systemic issues that went far beyond the small town of Shea County. The hashtag Justice for General Parker began trending across social media platforms. People from all walks of life joined in, demanding accountability for those in power. It wasn't just about what happened that day on the side of Highway 280. It was about the countless similar incidents that had gone unchallenged. People were tired of seeing the same story unfold over and over again. A person of color being treated unfairly, their rights violated, and no one taking responsibility. The fallout spread quickly. Protests were organized outside the sheriff's office in Shea County, and soon they reached other cities across the state. But these protests were different. They were peaceful, focused not on anger but on change. People carried signs that read, "Accountability for all, no one is above the law, and justice for General Parker." The protests were quiet, thoughtful, and respectful, but their message was clear. People were no longer willing to stay silent. Back in Shea County, the tension was palpable. Officer Wilburn, who had once held her badge with such pride, was now on the defensive. The sheriff's office released a short, cold statement saying that they were investigating the incident, but the words felt hollow. The truth had already been seen. There was no hiding it now. The video of General Parker's detainment had shown the world what had happened, and the world was demanding answers. Sheriff Nix, who had been quiet up until that point, finally broke his silence. He had seen the footage. He had listened to the public outcry, and he knew that something had to change. "I've been in this county a long time," Sheriff Nix said in a public statement. "I've seen my share of trouble, but I've never seen something like this. Officer Wilburn made a mistake, a big one. And now we need to make things right. We will not tolerate abuse of power in this county." Through it all, General Parker remained resolute in his silence. He didn't seek the attention or the headlines. He didn't call for rallies or interviews. He didn't take to social media to air his grievances. Instead, he did what he had always done in his years of service. He quietly went about his duties, letting his actions speak louder than any words ever could. But his silence didn't mean indifference. It wasn't that he wasn't affected by what had happened. It wasn't that he didn't feel the sting of being mistreated on the side of that highway. No, it was far from that. But General Parker knew that his response to the situation was more important than the situation itself. He could have let anger take over. He could have screamed and shouted about the injustice he had faced. But he chose a different path. He chose restraint. As he sat at his desk in the days that followed, General Parker reflected on what had happened. He thought about the many moments in his career when he had been tested, when he had been pushed to the edge. But this time it wasn't a battlefield or a war zone. It was a small town in Georgia, a place that didn't seem to matter to the world. And yet, it was in that very place, on that very road, that something shifted. He knew that he had to make sure that something like this never happened again. It wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about his pride. It was about the message he could send by handling this the right way, by standing tall and showing the world that strength doesn't always come from shouting, it comes from standing firm in the face of adversity. A few days later, General Parker was invited to speak at a small veterans forum in Columbus, Georgia. It wasn't a huge event. It wasn't televised. But the people in that room were the ones who mattered most to him. Teachers, first responders, high school students, everyday people who weren't concerned with the political noise but with the values of integrity and justice. Standing at the podium, General Parker looked out at the crowd. He didn't have his military jacket on, and he didn't stand there with medals or stars on display. He was just a man who had lived a long life of service, trying to impart the wisdom he had learned along the way. He cleared his throat and spoke softly, but with the weight of experience behind every word. "I've faced hostility on foreign soil," he began. "I've worked under administrations that didn't want me in the room. I've been underestimated, dismissed, and rejected. But I've never been made to feel smaller than I did on that roadside in Georgia." The room was silent. No applause, no cheers, just quiet understanding. "But I won't carry anger," he continued. "That's not what this country needs. What we need is accountability, honesty, and a commitment to change. We can't fix what we pretend doesn't exist. If we want to move forward, we need to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be." For a moment, there was only silence in the room. No one clapped, no one cheered. But it didn't matter. General Parker knew that the truth he had just spoken was more powerful than any applause. It was a truth that needed to be heard, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it was difficult. The following weeks were a turning point. The incident with General Parker had sparked a conversation that people couldn't ignore. The footage of what had happened that day had spread across the world, and the question people were asking wasn't just what happened. It was, why does this keep happening? The conversations began in classrooms, in barbershops, at dinner tables. People were talking about racism, about bias, about the power dynamics that existed in law enforcement. They were asking why it was that a man who had served his country for over 3 decades could be treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. It wasn't just about the incident with Officer Wilburn anymore. It was about a system that allowed this to happen. It was about the power that some people had and how it was used to control and demean others. The public was no longer willing to stay silent. General Parker didn't ask for these conversations to happen. He didn't seek out the spotlight. But by standing still, by showing restraint, by refusing to let anger take over, he had done something far more powerful. He had forced people to listen. He had forced them to see the truth. And that truth began to spread. People began to question what they had accepted as normal. They began to see that accountability wasn't just about holding one officer accountable, it was about holding the system accountable. It was about creating a future where people like General Parker wouldn't have to worry about being treated unfairly, no matter where they were or who they were. A few weeks later, things had begun to settle down. The public eye had shifted to other stories, and the protests outside the sheriff's office in Shea County had faded. But the conversations about justice, respect, and power were still happening. General Parker had gone back to his life at the military base, resuming his duties with quiet dignity. But the lessons he had learned along the way, lessons about restraint, about honor, and about the power of standing tall, remained with him. He knew that the fight for justice wasn't over. It wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, disrespected, or misunderstood. It was about creating a future where dignity wasn't something you had to fight for, it was something everyone had by right. And so, General Parker continued to lead, to serve, and to teach others the values he had spent his entire life defending. "Strength isn't measured by how hard you hit," he would tell his cadets, his voice steady and calm. "It's measured by how much you choose not to hit. When you're wronged, everything in you wants to fight back. But real strength comes from choosing restraint, from choosing to stand tall, no matter what." And with those words, General William Parker continued to inspire change quietly, steadfastly, but with an impact that would never be forgotten.